So what should a business owner expect when they're receiving these funds in different tranches from a tax perspective? Can you speak, I know you're not a tax lawyer, but can you speak to in general terms how that shakes out?
Yeah, so the way it would shake out from the seller's perspective is, again, if it's a share purchase deal, it's beneficial from the capital gains exemption. You want to make sure you're working with your accounting advisors to track that income properly so that you can take advantage of whatever tax credits are available through the CRA. And if you're structuring it over a period of time, you want to make sure that you're claiming it over that period of time to the extent possible.
Stretching it out.
Yeah, to help the tax burden. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So there could be some advantages to doing some seller financing and not getting compensated in full.
Yeah, and the other thing that you kind of layer on to that is, from the buyer's perspective, if you're staying on for a period of time and providing transitional services, likely that's another agreement, some sort of contractor or employment agreement, depending on the relationship that you two ultimately decide or land on post-closing. So if you're staying on for a year or two or longer providing transitional services on the business, that's going to be, you'll be earning an income on that, and that'll be treated as, normal income for tax purposes.
How often are you seeing a business owner stay on, and for how long is normal?
Yeah, quite often. From the seller's perspective, if it's something you've been preparing for and you're ready to walk away, you want to negotiate that to be as short of a window as possible. And typically that's 6 months, or, we've seen 3 months, but that's really short. Gone are the days typically of just handing over the keys on the closing date, watching that money hit your account and taking off for vacation.
Those days existed?
Yeah, they did exist. Yeah. And it's shocking that sometimes that still happens. And then the buyer steps in and, maybe some of the things haven't been transitioned over from an operational perspective. So, you need to contact the seller for making sure that banking stuff is set up or vendors are being paid in a timely manner or those kinds of things. So it's helpful to make sure that, because a lot of times when you're negotiating the deal, you're just driving towards closing.
Get to close.
But that business exists the very next day. And so how it's going to function is an important thing to think about.
Get that transition. What advice do you have for buyer and seller planning for that transition, those first 100 days?
Yeah, I mean, it's critical, especially if there's some sort of working capital adjustment or something that happens typically 90 days closing, where, there's transactions that'll inevitably flow through closing before and after that rightfully belong to one or the other party. So taking a look back 90 days later and doing some sort of an adjustment so that, both parties are made whole based on that is important to think about. From the seller's perspective, it's also important to think about what your life looks like post-closing. Do you want to walk away? Do you want to be involved? Is there a certain period of time that you want to continue to earn an income for? And is that something that's important to negotiate into the deal?
Or I guess if the business wasn't planning to sell, but you were entertaining this conversation with a purchaser, maybe it's you're joining that journey and you're combining forces and working together for a couple of years to achieve goals or until your succession plan makes sense.
Yeah. And that's where it gets really tricky when you're negotiating the transaction, getting to closing, thinking about what does the post-closing relationship look like, particularly if there's an earnout component attached to the deal. It might be a strong motivating factor for the seller to stay on through the period of the earnout so that they can make sure that the business operates as it was before. No relationships are impacted in an adverse way that could have, unintended consequences on the financial performance or, metrics of the business that could then impact how much of the earnout you're able to earn. So you want to make sure the business is humming along as it was before, making sure that all those transactions that you had in the pipeline close so that you're meeting those thresholds to get to make that earnout
You're
back.
Highly motivated if some of that compensation is
tied to that.
And
so if you're negotiating tooth and nail, getting to closing, and at the end, you got to think about what happens next day. That's something that the seller's got to, it's a fine balancing act there too, and can be awkward at times because, sometimes the negotiations get tricky and there's sensitivities on both sides. And then, inevitably at some point, because of the back and forth, every seller has this thought of like, is this actually going to close? Have I made a huge mistake? There's inevitably deal fatigue that creeps in at some point where you're just exhausted with the back and forth of the negotiation. It can feel like a lot of paperwork. Lawyers are involved throughout that whole process, a lot of phone calls. It's an emotional journey for a seller. So being ready for that ride is important, and also making sure that it's something that you're prepared to do and that it doesn't adversely impact the business operations, because one of the terms is likely going to be making sure that the business operates in the ordinary course through that, deal period, so that when the buyer takes over, there hasn't been any, impact on the financial performance.
Absolutely. So you don't really want to step into this process on a whim. You should be at least seriously contemplating a sale of the business before going down this path.
Prepared for that journey for sure, because it's definitely a journey.
So I want to come back to the buying party, and if you get that call about, hey, would you be interested in selling your business, and who that buying party is, and doing your research on that buying party. There's lots of different types of buyers out there. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure. Yeah. So, again, if it's a strategic buyer, likely in that situation, there might be some familiarity with the buyer. There might not be, depending on, whether they're in the industry or adjacent to the industry. There's got to be some sort of alignment there. Typically in those situations, if they're familiar enough with the industry and the business, they don't really need you sticking around for a long time, because you got to think about it from the buyer's perspective too. And if they want to take over and run it their way, they're now the captain of the ship. It can be difficult or tricky sometimes, because employees are then wondering, who's the boss here? Who's in charge?
Are we all going to still have jobs? Are we still all needed and wanted?
Right. So, managing all of that stuff is important. From the seller side, being as prepared for a sale as early on in the process as possible is important. Making sure that you have strong employment agreements with your staff, with termination provisions in case the buyer wants to let some staff go in advance of closings, so that you're not left with a huge severance obligation or something like that. And then on the private equity side, if that's the type of buyer that you're interacting with and that sends over the offer, they might want you to stay on longer than you're willing to. They might want you to give them a 5-year window, or they just want you to run it. They just add the business to their portfolio of companies, and then eventually someone will step in and take over the management and operations.
And you want to explain for those that might not be as familiar with private equity, can you explain a little bit about what a private equity group is?
Yeah, so private equity group is a group that, their whole objective is to just accumulate companies and growing through acquisition. And they're probably funded by, private investors, high net worth individuals, other organizations, stuff like that. So it's important from the seller side to know how their prospective buyer is financed, and where that money is coming from, having certainty that and security that money is there. Typically, 2 conditions in a letter of intent are going to be due diligence condition and a financing condition, and those will both have to be waived before the deal goes unconditional, and then you really are driving towards the path of executing and completing the closing.
And so talk about the financing condition a bit more.
Sure.
So that is
for the protection of both parties. For the buyer, it allows them an off-ramp if they don't have, or they're not able to get financing to acquire the business within a certain time period, and waive that condition. And for the seller, it provides them with certainty that the party that you're negotiating with does have sufficient capital to complete the proposed transaction.
We at Village, we work with strategic buyers, so existing corporations looking to grow through acquisition. And then we also work with high net worth individuals or individuals who are raising capital for their acquisition. Okay. But there's a lot of folks out there that are just looking to buy businesses and maybe haven't secured the capital that they need. So have you run into that, or what's your advice for a business owner who might come in contact with a party who maybe can't demonstrate their funding?
Yeah, and that's important consideration from a due diligence perspective from the seller. It's not just the buyer looking at you. You have to also vet the buyer, especially if you're going to enter into a letter of intent that provides for an exclusivity period where now you're tied just to this potential buyer. And if you're a seller that wasn't looking around, maybe that's not a big deal because you're not entertaining or soliciting potential offers from anybody else in the market at that time. But you also don't want to get locked in for a long period of time with someone that's potentially just a tire kicker or doesn't actually have the means of getting the transaction done. So doing some due diligence, understanding who the buyer is. Of course, if they come through, an organization like Village Wellth or they're working with a broker, that provides some assurances and security for the buyer, for the seller, because then they know that someone has vetted this buyer and they are a legit party.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's great advice. And just ask, what type of buyer are you? Are you a private equity? Are you an existing business?
It shouldn't just be a one-way flow of information. When we're entering into the NDA, even though it's a buyer buying a seller, we always try to make sure that it's a mutual NDA so that the seller also has the ability to request information about the buyer to the extent necessary for them to feel comfortable selling to that party.
That's a great point, that it's a mutual NDA on both parties.
Right.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Did we cover everything in that?
I think so.